Question 1 comes from Gill, who is a PhD student in Canada. She is a part-time distance learning PhD student. So shout out to all our part-timers and our distance learners. And she asks, I struggle most with writing when there is too big a gap between where I am sitting with my notes and where I need to be writing sentences. What do I do? Now, I absolutely love this question because I think it already shows quite a lot of insight and understanding. Often when people come to me, they say, I'm just struggling to write. I just intend to write and then I can't write. And if that's where you're at, there's a bunch of episodes on the podcast already about how to write when you're struggling to write, which is one of my early podcasts. And then a couple of episodes, three different episodes with guests, with Joe Van Every, with Alison Miller, and with Katie Peplin, all about writing and getting going on writing. And I'll link those in the show notes for you. However, this is more specific because what I love about it is Jill showing real insight into the problem here. She says she struggles most when there's too big a gap between where she is and where she needs to be. If you can get specific, the way Jill is getting specific with her challenges here, you are already 5 steps along the way to solving this, even without me helping along the way. So she's showing real insight. She also went on to say, and this is where she's already starting to be curious. She's already starting to figure out approaches for herself. So she says, what I'm slowly learning is that there are several iterations of working my notes to get them from high level sorting by theme down to, I want this paragraph to argue point A backed up with evidence points B, C, and D. And essentially here, Jill is answering her own question, which is amazing. Which is that often if we can notice what the real problem is, i.e. that there's a really big gap between sitting with your notes and having coherent sentences, then we can already start to speculate about what the solution might be. And what's happening here is Jill is already recognizing that she needs to see that there are several steps. Often we think that if we've got our notes here, we should be able to write paragraphs there. And we get really frustrated when that's not possible and when we struggle with that. We make it mean something about us rather than making it mean something about our technique. And the technique that we're missing here is this understanding that there's several iterations in between those 2 points. However, Jill is still talking about struggling with this. So she's gone a really long way to identifying the problem, but let's think about some additional suggestions. So the first thing is, if we're trying to identify these interim goals, we need to be really clear on what they are. So often you hear people say, just write something bad first. And the difficulty is partly we're all kind of high achieving people. We don't really like writing things that are purposefully bad, but also what does that even mean? And how do you then turn something that's bad into something that's good? I think it works better, instead of thinking about it as a bad first draft, try to describe what it really is. So, for example, if you're starting from your notes, you might want to next go to having the one bullet point that sums up what that paragraph needs to say, the one point you want to make. Now, lots of you will say, yeah, but I don't know. I've got all these notes and I don't know what point I want to make. Perfect. We've now identified a new problem. So what we now need to do is figure out what point we want to make. And so what we can then do is set ourselves a different interim goal. So a next step for you might be to write down what you are thinking. So this isn't even a draft to be a bad draft. This is a draft to get it out of your head. This is a draft where we're just saying, I kind of want to say this, but then I don't really think that makes sense. So maybe I should say this instead, but then I don't know whether that links back to bloody blah. So you're literally doing sort of stream of consciousness of your thoughts about these notes. Because if we can get it out of our head and onto a piece of paper, it then is so much easier to do this next iteration, which is to start to pick that apart and kind of go, oh, well, that could be a key point, I suppose. And that could be. And maybe my next step would then be to decide which of those points I want to make, for example. But by really turning it into very tangible steps that aren't just write the next sentence, but instead identifying actually different steps that will move you from having your notes to having sentences. You may have seen on my Instagram. If you're not following me, by the way, make sure you are. I have more people on my newsletter than I do on my Instagram, which is a bit strange. So make sure you're following me at the PhD Life Coach. I'm going to be posting much more regularly for reasons I'll tell you about at the end. Anyway, I said on my Instagram recently a little quote that I came up with when I was coaching some people in my membership last week, which was, if you're struggling to see the light at the end of the tunnel, shorten the tunnel. If you're struggling to think, right, I'm only going to celebrate when this paper's finished, for example, and that feels like a really, really long way away, we need to shorten that tunnel, give ourselves much smaller tasks to do, and then celebrate the light on those tunnels. So in this case, for Gill, when she's starting with sitting from her notes, that first light, that first short tunnel might be to get from sitting with my notes to writing 2 pages of whatever comes out of my head, including what I don't know, so that I've got something to work with. And then we celebrate, we enjoy that. And then when we're ready to enter another tunnel, another task, we look at that and pull out, what are 3 points that I could make, for example. Okay, so we're sort of creating something where it feels like you're going through distinct steps. And many of these steps are just for you. These are not for anybody else to ever read. These are to get your head straight. Now, one of the reasons that so many of you will find this challenging is because people very rarely talk about these steps. And the reason I think for that is partly people who are highly skilled don't understand exactly what they've done to get to be highly skilled. They kind of take it for granted. So have you ever been like taught to drive or anything by somebody who's really good at it? So my stepdaughters, one's just learned, one's about to learn. And my husband grew up on a farm. He's been driving tractors since he was 9. He knows exactly how to reverse a vehicle with a trailer, all sorts of things like that. But he can't explain it to someone who doesn't know, because he's just like, well, you just back it up over there into the space. And he can't give step-by-step notes. And you will find that your supervisors are very similar. They often won't be able to describe the steps they go through in order to write a paper. In fact, especially if they often write on the same topics, they may not even go through all these steps, because they can go from vague ideas in their head to a plan to a draft. They don't need all those steps in between. And then the people that are taking all these steps, the people that are doing postdocs, the people that are at the beginnings of their academic career, or people who are more senior but have always found their writing more stressful, they don't really have the platform to talk about how they do this. And often they do it in a way that's driven by panic and self-hatred anyway. They haven't necessarily discovered sort of a fun, iterative process that you can go from notes to an okay draft. So that's why if you're finding this hard, don't worry. No one really teaches this stuff, or very few people teach this stuff. Very few people know it themselves, and even fewer are telling you about it. So don't make it mean anything that you don't know this. The final thing to say is to keep an eye on some of those thoughts. So often when we're describing this stuff, we're talking about things we have problems. We, like Gill, talk about it as being a struggle. I struggle with writing when there's a big gap. Well, of course you do. That's not a struggle. That's just the process. This is the route that people take to getting writing done. And the fact that you're wrestling with it means you are engaging in an academic pursuit. The fact that you're thinking, oh, shall I say it like this or shall I say it like that, means you're doing the thing. This is not a sign you're doing it wrong. This is the sign that you're an academic. So don't problematize the fact that it takes you a bunch of drafts to write something that sounds half decent. That is literally how it's done. So for all the rest of you, copy Gill, get really specific about which bit you're struggling with. And then, as I've demonstrated hopefully today, it's quite straightforward to identify steps that you can take to close that gap between where you feel like it's all difficult to actually doing the thing. Let me know whether that resonated with you. So when you send me questions, let me know how you feel about that one as well, how that could get you writing something that you're finding difficult at the moment.